Hello, welcome to this series of short videos on authentic learning. But first, what do we mean when we use the term authentic learning? There's many definitions around, such as real experiences that students must be involved in real situations, or work experience and practicum, excursions, perhaps field placements, or perhaps working with real clients where students work on real problems and come up with a really useful product for those clients. Often it means going outside the school or university, and some people say, well, you can't have authentic learning in a learning institution. It has to be outside. Others might take a more low-key approach and say, well, as long as you're using real-life examples in the teaching that you're doing and in students' learning experiences, then it will be authentic. Another definition is learning that happens spontaneously, and in fact, this would imply that there can be no pedagogical approach to this, no planning for learning, because it just happens spontaneously. Well, we would say that there is a pedagogical approach that you can apply when you design your learning environments to help to make them more authentic. And these will be explained in more depth in other movies in this series. But first of all, what I want to do in this introduction is look at what is an authentic task. And I'm going to do that by giving you some examples that are not good examples of authentic learning tasks. So, of course, this kind of activity you would recognise is not really an authentic task. Usually students would, if they don't know what X stands for, they will simply solve it as an algorithm without really thinking through what it actually represents. Similarly, this is another problem that you frequently find where words are put into examples to try and give some authenticity to it. But if you actually read this example, it just doesn't make any sense. Why would anybody want to know the answer to that question, even though it's an important mathematical concept? Of course, this would make plenty of sense to a very experienced mathematician, but usually for somebody learning mathematics, it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Here's a really interesting one. If there are 26 sheep and 10 goats on a ship, how old is the captain? Now, Schoenfeld called this, or gave this as an example of non-reason, willingness to engage in anything that doesn't make sense. But I'm sure you'd recognise that many primary or elementary students, when they're given this problem, would say that the answer is 36. And not because they're stupid, just because they know the teacher wants them to answer that question, and there's two numbers there, so most likely they want them to add them up. Collins also talked about these suboptimal schemes for remembering information just to pass tests, and an example of that would be where students use the word left in a mathematical problem, and they'd say, oh, that must be a subtraction problem. Here's one from physics. If a person jumps off a moving bus, how would that affect the speed of the bus? When this would happen in real life, things would happen that weren't necessarily related to the actual problem as it's described there. Something would happen. Someone would notice. Perhaps the driver brakes, so that would slow the bus down. But that's not what's meant in the question. So you have to take into account the real life context. In fact, people, you might as well use those other reactions that people have when you describe the problem and in the solving of the problem. Interestingly, most video games, because they don't have a product, a real product, even though there's plenty of tacit learning that can happen in games, educational games and other games, there's a lot of knowledge that is gained, but there is no product that the students create. So in terms of our definition, most video games would not really qualify. Of course, it depends on how they're used, but really if it's just a game that students are given and there's no product that arises from it, a tangible product, then it wouldn't really be considered to be authentic according to our definition. And sometimes you can find really funny examples of things that teachers have done, and they've usually gotten into trouble because they end up in the newspaper. But in this particular example, mathematics teachers tried to give students quizzes that involve prostitutes and drive-by shootings and guns and drug taking, and that just got the teachers into trouble. And here's another one. A teacher was using the F word in order to teach English, whether it was a verb or a noun and so forth. So kind of real world examples, but what we wouldn't really call them authentic. So what is an authentic learning environment? There's a pretty good example in this site, which was made by Peter Morrissey at Coonabarabran High School to teach Year 10 history. This is a memorial which is found in nearly every town in Australia of the fallen soldiers. And what the students do, they would go and choose a name from the wall or look at it on the web, and then they would research that soldier's history. So they have an opportunity not just to study history, but to be researchers in this regard. So once the students have the soldier's name, they then go to these resources, which is on Peter's website, but it's also freely available researching information, which is from the Australian War Memorial website. They would go to the biographical section and look for that soldier's name. All the enlistment records are on PDF on this site, so the students can find out some details about the soldier, the age of the soldier, his parents, where they lived, and what the parents' occupations were, and so forth, to start to gain a bit of an idea about this soldier's life story. And then the other resources that are there, the student can follow the battalion that the soldier enlisted in, and then can work through and create a bit of a story about that soldier in World War I. And sometimes these stories that the students create are published in the local newspaper. So the students have had a real example to try to actually be historians. So we've identified these 9 elements of authentic learning, which we've written about in our book. There's also a website on authenticlearning.info that you can look at where these movies are embedded. And there's a short movie on each of these, which you can also look at in YouTube.